Marcus Williams had always been the type of kid who preferred the shadows to the spotlight, finding comfort in the spaces between conversations where he could observe rather than participate. At 17, he possessed a lean, athletic build that his oversized hoodies and careful posture worked hard to conceal. His gentle brown eyes, magnified slightly behind wire-rimmed glasses that had been his constant companion since middle school, held a depth that suggested he had seen more of life's complexities than most teenagers his age. There was something about the way he carried himself, a measured quality to his movements, a deliberate nature to his steps, that spoke of someone who had learned to be very aware of his own body and its capabilities. When his family moved to the small town of Ridgemont in the middle of his junior year, Marcus had entertained cautious hopes that this time might be different. Their previous 3 moves had all followed the same pattern. His father's job in software development would take them to a new city. Marcus would spend weeks researching the local schools and their social dynamics through whatever information he could glean from social media and local news, and then he would craft what he hoped would be an invisible persona that would allow him to blend in seamlessly until graduation. Ridgemont seemed promising at first glance. The town was large enough to have a decent-sized high school where one more quiet kid might easily disappear into the crowd, but small enough that the social hierarchies hadn't yet crystallized into the rigid castes that plagued larger schools. The move itself had been relatively smooth. His mother, Sarah, had found work as a pediatric nurse at the local hospital within 2 weeks, and his father, David, had been able to negotiate a fully remote position with his current company, eliminating the stress of job hunting in a new market. Marcus had spent the week before school started driving around town in his mother's Honda Civic, familiarizing himself with the layout of Ridgemont and getting a feel for the local teenage ecosystem. He observed the spots where kids gathered, the parking lot of the 24-hour diner on Main Street, the basketball courts behind the community center, the sprawling lawn in front of the public library where students spread blankets and pretended to study while actually engaged in elaborate social rituals. He noted which restaurants seemed to cater to the high school crowd, which stores had no loitering signs that suggested ongoing tensions with teenagers, and which neighborhoods housed the kinds of families that produced the social elite of any given high school. His new bedroom faced east, and Marcus had developed a routine of waking before dawn to practice his forms in the garage before anyone else in the house stirred. The morning light filtering through the single window created dramatic shadows as he moved through the precise, flowing movements that had become as natural to him as breathing over the past 8 years. His training had begun when he was 9 years old, and his family lived in Denver after a particularly brutal incident with a group of older kids had left him with a black eye and a profound sense of helplessness that his parents had been desperate to address. Master Kim's dojang had been located in a strip mall between a Korean barbecue restaurant and a dry cleaner, its modest exterior giving no hint of the transformation that would take place within its walls. Master Kim himself was a compact man in his 60s with calloused hands and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's core. He had taken one look at 9-year-old Marcus, small for his age, shy to the point of seeming mute, with the kind of nervous energy that came from constantly being on guard, and had somehow known exactly what the boy needed. The training had been different from what Marcus had expected. He had imagined learning flashy kicks and dramatic throws, the kind of moves he had seen in movies and video games. Instead, Master Kim had started with breathing exercises, meditation, and endless repetitions of basic stances that seemed to have no practical application. For the first 6 months, Marcus had been convinced that he was wasting his time and his parents' money. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, things had begun to change. His posture improved first, then his confidence. The nervous fidgeting that had characterized his childhood gave way to a stillness that seemed to radiate outward from his center. He learned to see conflict before it escalated, to read the subtle signs in body language and tone that indicated when a situation was about to turn dangerous. Most importantly, he learned that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the discipline to choose when and how to act. By the time his family moved to Phoenix when he was 13, Marcus had earned his black belt and had begun competing in regional tournaments. He discovered that he had a natural aptitude for the sport that went beyond just physical ability. He possessed an almost preternatural ability to read his opponents, to anticipate their moves and counter them with minimal effort. His fighting style was economical, efficient, and devastatingly effective when he chose to employ it. The move to Phoenix had brought new challenges. Desert Ridge High School was larger and more competitive than his previous school, with social hierarchies that had been established over years of shared history. Marcus had managed to navigate those waters by joining the school's small but dedicated martial arts club, where his skills had earned him respect without drawing unwanted attention from the broader student body. He had made a few close friends among his teammates and had even begun dating a girl named Jessica who shared his interest in quiet pursuits like reading and hiking. But then his father's company had restructured and the family had been forced to move again. The goodbye with Jessica had been particularly painful, not just because Marcus had cared about her, but because it had represented the first time he had allowed himself to become truly attached to the life he had built in any given place. The pattern of constant relocation was wearing on him, and he had begun to wonder if he would ever have the chance to plant roots deep enough to sustain genuine relationships. Now, standing in the parking lot of Ridgemont High School on a crisp Monday morning in February, Marcus felt the familiar mixture of hope and resignation that accompanied each new beginning. The building itself was typical of schools built in the 1980s. Red brick and glass, sprawling across several acres with various wings and additions that spoke of decades of enrollment growth and budget constraints. Students streamed through the main entrance in clusters, their clothing and body language immediately sorting them into the invisible but unmistakable categories that existed in every high school in America. Marcus had spent hours studying the school's website and social media presence, trying to map the social terrain he was about to enter. Ridgemont High had approximately 1,800 students, making it larger than his previous school, but not overwhelmingly so. The athletic programs seemed to dominate the school's identity, with particular emphasis on football and basketball. The academic programs were solid, if unspectacular, with a decent selection of advanced placement courses and a surprisingly robust arts department. What concerned Marcus most was what he had observed about the school's disciplinary climate. While the official website spoke in glowing terms about the school's commitment to creating a safe and inclusive environment, the student-generated content on various social platforms told a different story. There were references to conflicts between different social groups, complaints about administrative indifference to bullying, and an underlying current of tension that suggested all was not well beneath the surface of Ridgemont High's carefully crafted public image. His first period was advanced English literature with Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 50s whose reputation for being both demanding and fair had been established through decades of teaching. Marcus arrived 10 minutes early, choosing a seat in the third row, close enough to demonstrate engagement without appearing overeager, far enough back to avoid unwanted attention. He pulled out a worn copy of Crime and Punishment and began reading, using the book as both a shield and a signal to other students that he was serious about his academics. The classroom filled gradually, and Marcus used his peripheral vision to catalogue his new classmates. There was the usual assortment of types. The theatre kids clustered near the front, already engaged in animated discussions about some upcoming production. The athletes scattered throughout the room, their letter jackets and team logos serving as tribal identifiers, The academic overachievers with their color-coded planners and multiple writing implements. The social butterflies who seemed incapable of sitting still or speaking at normal volume. And then there was the group that immediately drew Marcus's attention, though he was careful not to let his interest show. 3 boys entered together about 2 minutes before the bell, their confident stride and casual disregard for the students they jostled past, marking them clearly as members of the school's social elite. The tallest of the 3 was broad-shouldered and blonde, with the kind of square jaw and perfect teeth that suggested good genetics and expensive orthodontic work. His varsity jacket bore the name Brennan and the number 42, along with patches indicating his participation in both football and wrestling. Tyler Brennan moved through the classroom with the unconscious arrogance of someone who had never had his authority seriously challenged. His 2 companions flanked him like satellites orbiting a star. One was shorter and stockier, with dark hair and small, mean eyes that seemed to be constantly searching for weakness in others, while the other was tall and lanky with a shock of red hair and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he compensated for his own insecurities by attaching himself to someone more confident. Marcus watched as Tyler surveyed the available seats with the calculating gaze of someone choosing a strategic position. His eyes lingered for a moment on Marcus, taking in the wire-rimmed glasses, the carefully neutral expression, and the posture that suggested someone trying very hard to be invisible. There was something predatory in that gaze, a recognition that made Marcus's stomach tighten with familiar dread. Mrs. Patterson entered the room with the kind of purposeful energy that immediately commanded attention. She was a compact woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. Her reputation for maintaining order in her classroom was legendary, and Marcus had hoped that her presence might serve as a deterrent to any potential troublemakers. But as she launched into her introduction to their upcoming unit on Russian literature, Marcus noticed that Tyler and his friends seemed remarkably adept at towing the line, engaging just enough to avoid censure while maintaining an undercurrent of disruptive energy that kept the entire class slightly on edge. The period passed without incident, but Marcus felt Tyler's attention returning to him periodically throughout the lesson. It was like feeling the weight of a predator's gaze, and Marcus found himself unconsciously cataloguing escape routes and defensive positions, even as he tried to concentrate on Mrs. Patterson's discussion of Dostoevsky's exploration of guilt and redemption. When the bell rang, Marcus deliberately took his time packing his materials, hoping to let the room clear before making his exit. But Tyler and his friends seemed to have the same idea, lingering near the door in a way that forced every other student to squeeze past them. As Marcus approached, Tyler stepped slightly into his path, not enough to be obviously confrontational, but sufficient to establish his presence. "New kid, right?" Tyler's voice was friendly enough on the surface, but there was an undercurrent that set Marcus's nerves on edge. "I'm Tyler Brennan. This is Jake Morrison and Derek Walsh." He gestured to his companions, who nodded in a way that managed to be both welcoming and vaguely threatening. "Marcus Williams," Marcus replied quietly, adjusting his backpack and preparing to move past them. "Williams," Tyler repeated, as if testing the name. "Where'd you transfer from?" "Phoenix," Marcus answered, hoping that brevity might discourage further conversation. Jake snorted. "Long way from home, desert boy. What brought your family to our little slice of paradise?" Marcus could feel the trap being laid, though he wasn't yet sure of its exact nature. "My dad's job," he said simply. Derek grinned, revealing teeth that were slightly too small for his mouth. "What's he do?" "Your dad?" "Software development." Tyler nodded, as if this information confirmed something he had already suspected. "Computer nerd family. That explains the glasses." His tone remained conversational, but Marcus caught the subtle shift that indicated the conversation was moving into dangerous territory. "I should get to my next class," Marcus said, taking a step toward the door. "What's the rush?" Tyler asked, not moving aside. "We're just being friendly. It's important for new students to feel welcome, don't you think?" Mrs. Patterson had been erasing the whiteboard, but Marcus noticed her glance toward their group with a slight frown. He also noticed that Tyler's awareness of her attention was acute. His posture and tone shifted almost imperceptibly whenever she looked their way, projecting innocent friendliness while maintaining the underlying tension that had Marcus's fight-or-flight instincts screaming warnings. "I appreciate the welcome," Marcus said carefully, "but I really do need to get to chemistry." "Chemistry, huh?" Jake laughed. "Let me guess, you're one of those kids who actually enjoys school." Marcus didn't respond, instead attempting to step around the group. This time Tyler moved more decisively, positioning himself directly in Marcus's path. "You know what I like about new kids?" Tyler asked, his voice dropping just enough that Mrs. Patterson wouldn't be able to hear from across the room. "They haven't learned the rules yet. They don't understand how things work around here." Marcus felt his training kick in automatically. His center of gravity lowered slightly, his weight distributed more evenly between his feet, his awareness expanding to include the positions of Tyler's friends and the locations of potential obstacles or weapons in the immediate environment. But he forced himself to remain still, to project the same nervous uncertainty that Tyler was clearly expecting. "I'm not looking for trouble," Marcus said quietly. "Of course you're not," Derek said with false sympathy. "Nobody ever is. Trouble just has a way of finding certain types of people." The warning bell rang, indicating that students had 5 minutes to reach their next class. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her desk and called out, "Gentlemen, you need to clear out. I have another class coming in." Tyler's smile was brilliant and completely genuine as he turned toward the teacher. "Of course, Mrs. Patterson. We were just welcoming our new classmate." He stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, gesturing for Marcus to precede him through the door. As Marcus walked past, Tyler's voice followed him, pitched just loud enough for him to hear, "See you around, Williams." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of introductions, syllabi, and the usual first day at a new school rituals. Marcus's schedule was demanding. Advanced placement chemistry, honors algebra 2, world history, and Spanish 3 filled his morning block. He had deliberately chosen a rigorous academic load, partly because he genuinely enjoyed learning, but also because he had discovered that teachers tended to be more protective of students who demonstrated serious commitment to their education. Each transition between classes brought the possibility of another encounter with Tyler's group, and Marcus found himself unconsciously planning routes that would minimize exposure while still allowing him to reach his destinations on time. He began to notice other students who seemed to be employing similar strategies, kids who kept their heads down, who timed their movements to avoid certain areas of the school, who had developed an almost supernatural awareness of where potential threats might be lurking. The chemistry lab was located in the newer wing of the school, and Marcus arrived early enough to claim a lab station near the back of the room, where he would have good sight lines and multiple exit options. His lab partner turned out to be a quiet girl named Sarah Chen, who seemed as focused on academics as he was. They worked through the introductory experiment in comfortable silence, and Marcus began to hope that he might have found at least one class where he could relax his vigilance. But even in the relative safety of the chemistry lab, Marcus found his attention drifting to the dynamics he was observing throughout the school. Ridgemont High operated according to the same basic social laws that governed every high school he had attended, but there were subtle variations that spoke to the specific culture that had evolved within these walls. The athletic elite held the apex of the social pyramid, as was typical, but their dominance seemed more absolute here than at his previous schools. There was a quality of barely controlled aggression in their interactions with other students that suggested they were accustomed to getting their way through intimidation rather than genuine leadership. The administrative presence was notably light in the hallways. Marcus had seen only 2 teachers monitoring the corridors between classes, and both had seemed more interested in checking their phones than observing student behavior. The lack of supervision created an environment where the unofficial power structures could operate with minimal interference, and Marcus suspected that Tyler and his friends had learned to exploit those gaps in oversight. World history proved to be another potential minefield. The teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, seemed well-meaning but overwhelmed, and his classroom management style relied heavily on trying to befriend his students rather than maintaining clear boundaries. Tyler's group wasn't in this class, but Marcus quickly identified several other students who radiated the same predatory energy. They seemed to form an interconnected network throughout the school, with Tyler's crew serving as the apex predators and various smaller groups of wannabes and enforcers filling out the hierarchy. During the lunch period, Marcus decided to conduct what he mentally termed a reconnaissance mission. Rather than heading directly to the cafeteria, he took a circuitous route through the main building, ostensibly looking for the guidance counselor's office, but actually mapping the school's social geography. He noted which areas seemed to be claimed by specific groups, which hallways were heavily trafficked and which were relatively isolated, and where the various cliques gathered to eat and socialize. The cafeteria itself was a study in tribal organization. The popular kids commanded the center tables, their elevated position giving them clear sightlines to monitor the entire room. The various subgroups, athletes, theater kids, academic overachievers, art students and others, arranged themselves in concentric circles around the core of social power. The outcasts and loners were relegated to the tables near the walls, where they could eat in relative anonymity, but were also more vulnerable to harassment since they were farther from adult supervision. Marcus selected a table that offered good visibility while keeping him relatively inconspicuous. Close enough to the center to avoid being labeled as a complete outsider, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention from the power brokers. He had packed his lunch, partly out of frugality, but mainly because it gave him more control over his environment. Standing in line for cafeteria food would make him a stationary target, and he preferred to maintain his mobility. As he ate his turkey sandwich and observed the complex social dynamics unfolding around him, Marcus became aware that he was being watched in return. Tyler's table was positioned to command a view of the entire cafeteria, and Marcus could feel those cold blue eyes assessing him periodically. Jake and Derek flanked Tyler like bodyguards, and they seemed to be engaged in some kind of ongoing commentary about the other students in the room. Marcus was halfway through his lunch when Tyler stood up and began walking in his direction. The movement was casual, almost aimless, but Marcus's trained eye caught the purposeful nature of Tyler's approach. Jake and Derek remained seated, but their attention was clearly focused on their leader's movement across the room. Other students seemed to sense the shift in energy. Conversations died down at nearby tables, and Marcus could feel the weight of multiple gazes tracking Tyler's progress. "Mind if I sit?" Tyler asked, his tone perfectly polite as he gestured to the empty chair across from Marcus. Marcus looked up from his sandwich, meeting Tyler's gaze steadily. "It's a free country." Tyler's smile was sharp-edged as he settled into the chair. "So, how's your first day going, Williams? Everyone treating you well?" "No complaints so far," Marcus replied carefully. "That's good to hear. We pride ourselves on being a welcoming community here at Ridgemont." Tyler's tone was conversational, but Marcus could sense the predatory calculation behind the words. "Though I have to say, you seem a little tense, like you're expecting trouble." Marcus took a bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly while he considered his response. "Just trying to get oriented. New school, new people, it takes time to adjust." Of course it does, Tyler agreed. And it's natural to be cautious, smart even. There are definitely people here you want to avoid, if you know what I mean. Such as? Tyler's eyes glittered with amusement. Well, that depends on what kind of person you are, doesn't it? Some kids come in thinking they're hot shit because they were somebody at their old school. They don't realize that none of that matters here. What matters is how well you fit in with the established order. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded moments of genuine danger. Tyler wasn't just making conversation, he was establishing dominance, marking territory, setting the terms for all future interactions. "I'm not looking to be anybody special," Marcus said quietly. "I just want to finish high school and move on with my life." "See, that's exactly the right attitude," Tyler said, leaning back in his chair with obvious satisfaction. "Keep your head down, don't cause problems, and you'll do just fine here. But it's amazing how many new kids just can't seem to grasp that simple concept." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Tyler maintaining his facade of friendly advice while steadily escalating the underlying threat level. He talked about various students who had failed to understand their place and had consequently faced natural consequences for their poor judgment. He mentioned incidents that had occurred in areas of the school where teacher supervision was minimal, and he made casual references to his own influence with both the administration and the local community. Through it all, Marcus maintained his composure, responding with just enough engagement to avoid seeming dismissive while being careful not to project either weakness or challenge. It was a delicate balancing act that required him to suppress every instinct his training had developed. Master Kim had taught him to recognize when someone was testing him, probing for weaknesses, and every fiber of his being was screaming warnings about Tyler's true intentions. When the lunch bell rang, Tyler stood with the fluid grace of a natural athlete. "It's been great talking with you, Williams. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of each other." He paused, his hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. "One last piece of advice. In a place like this, your reputation gets established pretty quickly. Make sure you're establishing the right kind." As Tyler walked away, Marcus forced himself to finish his lunch at a normal pace, even though his appetite had completely disappeared. He could feel other students watching him, trying to read the significance of Tyler's impromptu visit. Some looked sympathetic, as if they recognized the signs of someone being marked for future harassment. Others seemed almost relieved, perhaps grateful that Tyler's attention was focused elsewhere. The afternoon classes passed without major incident, but Marcus could sense the shift in how other students perceived him. Word had clearly spread about Tyler's lunchtime visit, and Marcus found himself receiving the kind of careful, pitying glances that suggested his classmates had already written him off as Tyler's next victim. Teachers who had been friendly during morning introductions now seemed slightly more distant, as if they were already beginning to distance themselves from what they anticipated would be an ongoing disciplinary problem. Spanish 3 with Senora Martinez was his final class of the day, and Marcus had hoped to end on a positive note. The teacher was young and enthusiastic, clearly passionate about her subject, and the classroom atmosphere was more relaxed than his other courses. But even here, Marcus found it difficult to concentrate fully. His awareness was constantly expanding beyond the immediate lesson to monitor the hallway traffic, track the movements of students who might be Tyler's allies, and plan his route to the exit when the final bell rang. When the dismissal bell finally sounded, Marcus implemented the strategy he had been developing throughout the day. Rather than joining the rush of students heading for the main exits, he took a circuitous route through the less traveled hallways, intending to exit through the side door near the gymnasium. This route would take him past the school's trophy cases and through the area where the arts classes were located, territories that seemed to be outside Tyler's immediate sphere of influence. The strategy worked perfectly. until he reached the junction where the main hallway connected with the corridor leading to his chosen exit. As he rounded the corner, he found himself face to face with Jake Morrison, who was leaning against a bank of lockers with the casual attitude of someone who had been waiting. "Hey there, Williams," Jake said, straightening up from his lounging position. "Funny running into you here." Marcus's training kicked in automatically, his awareness expanding to take in the entire tactical situation. The hallway was empty, except for the two of them. Most students had already left, or were taking more direct routes to the exits. The lighting was slightly dimmer here than in the main corridors, and there were several alcoves and doorways that could conceal additional threats. Most importantly, Jake's position and body language suggested this was not a chance encounter. "Just heading out," Marcus said evenly, adjusting his backpack and preparing to continue walking. "Hold up a minute," Jake said, not moving from his position blocking the corridor. "Tyler wanted me to give you something." From his jacket pocket, Jake pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out toward Marcus with a grin that was anything but friendly. "He thought you might want to read this before tomorrow." Marcus hesitated for a moment, then accepted the paper. As he unfolded it, Jake stepped closer. Close enough that Marcus could smell the mixture of cologne and teenage sweat that seemed to surround all of Tyler's crew. The note was written in Tyler's distinctive handwriting, bold, aggressive strokes that seemed to press through the paper. It read, "Williams, just wanted to make sure you understood our conversation today. Sometimes new kids get confused about how things work around here. Don't be one of those kids. There are consequences for poor decision-making, and I'd hate to see you learn that lesson the hard way. Your friend, Tyler." Marcus read the note twice, his expression carefully neutral. Then he folded it back up and tucked it into his own pocket. "Got it," he said simply. Jake seemed disappointed by the lack of visible reaction. "That's it? No questions? No smart comments? Should there be? Most kids would be more concerned, about what Tyler might do if they didn't take his advice seriously." Marcus met Jake's gaze directly. "I appreciate the message. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get home." For a moment, Jake seemed uncertain about how to proceed. He had clearly been expecting fear, pleading, or anger, some kind of emotional response that would confirm Marcus's status as a potential victim. The calm acceptance was apparently not part of the script he had been prepared to follow. "You're either really brave or really stupid," Jake said finally. "Maybe I'm just realistic," Marcus replied. As he walked past Jake toward the exit, Marcus could feel the other boy's confusion and frustration radiating behind him. He had managed to avoid escalating the confrontation, but he also understood that his refusal to display the expected fear had probably made the situation more complicated rather than less so. Tyler's crew was clearly accustomed to intimidating their targets into submission quickly and efficiently. Marcus's failure to follow the expected pattern would likely be seen as a challenge that required a more aggressive response. The walk home from school took Marcus through a residential neighborhood of modest houses and well-maintained yards. It was the kind of middle-class American suburb that existed in countless variations across the country, safe, predictable, and utterly normal on the surface. But Marcus found himself analyzing the terrain with tactical eyes, noting which houses had clear sightlines to the street, which yards offered concealment, and which routes would provide the best options for escape or evasion if he found himself being followed. His family's rental house was a two-story colonial with beige siding and green shutters, indistinguishable from dozens of others in the neighborhood. His mother's car was in the driveway, indicating that she had finished her shift at the hospital, and warm light glowed from the kitchen windows. The sight of home provided Marcus with his first moment of genuine relaxation since arriving at school that morning. "How was the first day?" his mother asked as he entered through the side door that led directly into the kitchen. Sarah Williams was a compact woman in her 40s with prematurely grey hair and the kind of competent, no-nonsense demeanour that served her well in her work as a paediatric nurse. She was standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled like homemade vegetable soup. "About what I expected," Marcus replied, setting his backpack on the kitchen table and accepting the glass of water his mother offered him. "Meet any interesting people?" Marcus considered his response carefully. His parents had never fully understood the extent of the social challenges he faced at school, partly because he had learned to shield them from the worst of it, and partly because their own high school experiences had been fundamentally different from his. His father had been a successful student and athlete who had navigated the social hierarchies with ease, while his mother had been part of a tight-knit group of academically focused students who had largely avoided the more aggressive aspects of teenage culture. "A few," he said finally, "still getting oriented." His mother nodded, returning her attention to the soup. "Your father should be home in about an hour. I thought we could have dinner together and maybe walk around the neighborhood afterward, get a better feel for the area." "Sounds good," Marcus agreed, though he was already thinking about how he would spend the evening. He needed to review his class schedules and assignments, but more importantly, he needed to process what he had learned about the social dynamics at Ridgemont High and develop a strategy for navigating the challenges that Tyler's attention was likely to bring. His bedroom was located at the front of the house, with windows that offered a view of the street and the neighboring houses. Marcus had arranged his furniture to maximize both privacy and tactical advantage. His desk was positioned so that he could see anyone approaching the house while appearing to be focused on homework, and his bed was placed to provide quick access to either the bedroom door or the window if circumstances required a rapid exit. The walls were decorated with a carefully curated selection of items that projected the image of a normal, academically focused teenager. His various martial arts trophies and medals were stored in a box in his closet rather than displayed prominently. While he was proud of his achievements, he had learned that advertising his training often created more problems than it solved. Instead, his bookshelf held an eclectic mix of science fiction novels, philosophy texts, and technical manuals related to computer programming, a hobby he had developed partly out of genuine interest and partly because it aligned with other people's expectations about his interests and capabilities. Marcus spent the next hour reviewing his class materials and beginning work on the assignments he had been given. The academic work was challenging but manageable, and he found himself genuinely interested in several of the topics, particularly Mrs. Patterson's plans for their exploration of Russian literature. But even as he worked through algebra problems and read about the causes of World War I, part of his mind was constantly analyzing the events of the day and planning for tomorrow. Tyler's approach had been more sophisticated than Marcus had initially anticipated. Rather than resorting to immediate physical intimidation, Tyler had chosen to establish psychological dominance first, using the implicit threat of future consequences to try to shape Marcus's behavior. It was the approach of someone who understood that true power came from making people fear what might happen, rather than from what actually did happen. The note from Jake had been another calculated move, designed to reinforce Tyler's message while also demonstrating that his reach extended beyond direct personal interactions. By having Jake deliver the message, Tyler had shown that he commanded loyalty from his followers and that Marcus couldn't simply avoid him by staying out of his immediate presence. But Tyler had also revealed something about his own psychology in the process. The need to establish dominance so quickly and thoroughly suggested someone who was insecure about his own position, someone who felt threatened by the mere presence of a potential rival. A truly confident leader would have been content to let new students find their own level within the social hierarchy. Tyler's immediate move to establish control suggested that he saw Marcus as a potential threat, though Marcus couldn't yet understand why. The family dinner was a pleasant respite from the tensions of the school day. His father, David Williams, was a soft-spoken man in his late 40s who had inherited his son's preference for observation over confrontation. He asked thoughtful questions about Marcus's classes and teachers without prying into the social aspects of the school experience, and he shared stories about his own adjustment to working remotely in a new environment. The evening walk through the neighborhood provided Marcus with another opportunity to study his new environment. The streets were well lit and safely suburban, with minimal traffic and the kind of community atmosphere that suggested people generally looked out for each other. But Marcus also noted the locations of the few areas where someone could potentially lie in wait. The small park, with its cluster of trees and playground equipment, the construction site where a new house was being built, and the poorly lit section where Maple Street curved behind a row of older houses with large, overgrown yards. By the time he went to bed, Marcus had developed a preliminary strategy for dealing with Tyler's campaign of intimidation. He would continue to project quiet compliance while avoiding any behavior that could be interpreted as either submission or challenge. He would vary his routes through the school and his timing for transitions between classes, making it more difficult for Tyler's crew to predict his movements. Most importantly, he would remain patient and alert, waiting for Tyler to either lose interest or escalate to the point where more decisive action became necessary. As he lay in the darkness of his new bedroom, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house settling and the distant hum of traffic, Marcus reflected on the lessons Master Kim had taught him about the nature of conflict. "Every fight begins long before the first blow is thrown," the old man had said. "The wise warrior wins by ensuring that the fight never becomes necessary. But when conflict becomes unavoidable, the wise warrior ends it as quickly and decisively as possible." Marcus had always struggled with the apparent contradiction between those two principles. How could you simultaneously avoid conflict and be prepared to end it decisively? But as he drifted off to sleep, he began to understand that the answer lay in patience and precise timing, in being willing to endure temporary discomfort in order to choose the moment and manner of any ultimate confrontation. The second day at Ridgemont High began with the same pre-dawn practice session in the garage, the same careful attention to route planning and timing, and the same hyper-awareness that had characterized his first day. But Marcus could sense immediately that something had changed in the school's atmosphere. Other students were looking at him differently, some with sympathy, others with the kind of morbid fascination that people displayed when watching someone walk toward a cliff. The morning classes passed without incident, but Marcus became increasingly aware that Tyler's influence extended throughout the school in ways that were both subtle and pervasive. Teachers who had been friendly the previous day were now noticeably cooler in their interactions with him. Students who had seemed open to conversation were suddenly finding reasons to avoid eye contact. It was as if an invisible barrier had been erected around him, marking him as someone to be avoided for the safety of others. The true test came, as Marcus had anticipated, during lunch period. He had deliberately chosen a different table from the previous day, positioning himself near a group of academic overachievers who seemed unlikely to be caught up in the school's more aggressive social dynamics. But when Tyler stood up from his usual table and began walking across the cafeteria, Marcus knew that his location wouldn't matter. This time, Tyler wasn't alone. Jake and Derek flanked him as he crossed the room, and their body language was noticeably more aggressive than it had been during the previous day's conversation. Other students seemed to sense the shift in energy. Conversations died down at nearby tables, and Marcus could feel the weight of dozens of eyes tracking Tyler's progress across the room. "Williams," Tyler said as he reached Marcus's table. He didn't ask permission to sit this time. Instead, he simply pulled out a chair and settled into it with casual authority. Jake and Derek remained standing, positioning themselves to block any potential escape routes. Tyler, Marcus replied evenly, setting down his sandwich but keeping his posture relaxed and non-threatening. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, Tyler continued, his tone conversational but with an edge that hadn't been present before. And I'm starting to wonder if maybe you didn't understand what I was trying to tell you. Marcus waited, neither confirming nor denying Tyler's suspicion. See, the thing is, Tyler went on, when someone gives you good advice, friendly advice, the normal response is gratitude, maybe even a little effort to show that you appreciate the guidance. I do appreciate it, Marcus said quietly. Tyler's smile was sharp and predatory. Really? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're going out of your way to avoid showing that appreciation, taking different routes through the school, sitting at different tables, acting like you're too good to follow simple suggestions. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded moments of genuine danger. Tyler had clearly been monitoring his movements, which meant that the harassment campaign was more organized and systematic than he had initially realized. I'm not trying to avoid anything, Marcus said carefully. I'm just trying to learn my way around. Learning your way around, Derek repeated with a snort of laughter. That's good, real good. Jake leaned down, placing his hands on the table and bringing his face closer to Marcus's. Maybe you need a more hands-on learning experience. You know, something to help the lessons stick. The implicit threat was now explicit, and Marcus could sense that they had reached a tipping point. The careful psychological campaign was giving way to something more direct and immediate. Around them, the cafeteria had grown noticeably quieter, with students either actively watching the confrontation or making obvious efforts to avoid looking in their direction. Marcus glanced toward the lunch monitors, hoping to see some sign of adult intervention. But Mrs. Henderson, the supervising teacher, was engaged in conversation with a colleague and seemed oblivious to the tension building at Marcus's table. The other monitor was dealing with a spilled drink at the far end of the cafeteria. What exactly are you suggesting? Marcus asked, his voice calm despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. Tyler's grin widened. I'm suggesting that maybe you need a more practical demonstration of how things work around here. Nothing too dramatic, just enough to help you understand your place. The moment stretched out, thick with tension and possibility. Marcus could feel his training responding automatically to the threat, his body preparing for conflict even as his mind raced through the potential consequences of different courses of action. He could defend himself, he had no doubt about that, but any physical confrontation in the cafeteria would bring administrative attention that might complicate his situation in ways he couldn't predict. More importantly, Master Kim had taught him that the first rule of conflict was to avoid it whenever possible. Violence should be a last resort, used only when all other options had been exhausted and the threat to oneself or others was immediate and severe. I understand how things work, Marcus said finally, his voice steady and controlled. And I'm not looking for any kind of demonstration. Tyler studied him for a long moment, clearly trying to read the true meaning behind Marcus's words. The lack of visible fear or submission was obviously frustrating to him, but he also seemed uncertain about how to proceed without escalating to a level that might attract unwanted attention from the administration. We'll see about that, Tyler said finally, standing up from the table. We'll definitely see about that. As Tyler and his crew walked away, Marcus became aware that the entire cafeteria was watching him with a mixture of sympathy and anticipation. He had successfully avoided immediate confrontation, but he also understood that he had probably only delayed the inevitable. Tyler's pride was now fully engaged, and the public nature of their exchange meant that backing down was no longer a viable option for either of them. The afternoon classes passed in a blur of academic content and social tension. Marcus found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on his lessons, as his awareness expanded to monitor the hallways, track the movements of Tyler's allies, and plan for various contingencies. The feeling of being watched was constant now, and he began to notice that Tyler's influence extended far beyond his immediate crew of followers. When the final bell rang, Marcus implemented a new strategy. Rather than attempting to leave the building immediately, he made his way to the library, where he could legitimately spend time working on homework while also monitoring the ebb and flow of student traffic. The library was one of the few spaces in the school where the normal social hierarchies seemed to be temporarily suspended. The academic focus and the presence of librarian Mrs. Foster created an environment where even Tyler's crew was unlikely to cause overt trouble. Marcus selected a table near the back of the library with good sightlines to both the main entrance and the emergency exit. He spread out his textbooks and began working on his algebra assignment, but his attention was constantly divided between the mathematical problems and the tactical situation developing around him. For the first hour, his strategy seemed to be working. The library filled with students working on various projects, and the atmosphere was calm and productive. But as the afternoon wore on and the crowd began to thin out, Marcus became aware that Jake Morrison had entered the library and was browsing the stacks in a way that kept Marcus's table within his sightlines. Marcus continued working on his homework, giving no sign that he had noticed Jake's presence, but internally he was running through contingency plans and calculating his options. The library's layout provided several potential escape routes, but it also contained numerous obstacles and blind corners that could work to an attacker's advantage. When Mrs. Foster announced that the library would be closing in 15 minutes, Marcus began packing his materials with deliberate slowness. He wanted to time his departure to coincide with the maximum number of other students leaving the building, reducing the likelihood of being cornered in an isolated area. As he gathered his books, Jake approached his table with the casual air of someone making an innocent inquiry. "How's the homework going, Williams? Getting all caught up on your assignments?" "Making progress," Marcus replied evenly, slipping his calculator into his backpack. "That's good. Tyler was wondering if you might want to study together sometime. You know, pool your resources, share notes, that kind of thing." Marcus looked up from his packing, meeting Jake's gaze directly. "That's thoughtful of him, but I usually work better alone." Jake's smile was thin and predatory. "Tyler thought you might say that. He also thought you might want to reconsider. Sometimes studying with the right people can really improve your grades." The implied threat was clear, but Marcus maintained his composure. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm doing fine on my own." "Are you sure about that?" Jake asked, his voice dropping to a level that wouldn't carry to Mrs. Foster's desk. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you could use all the help you can get." Marcus finished packing his backpack and stood up, checking to make sure he had everything. "Thanks for the concern, but I'm good." As he walked toward the library exit, Marcus could feel Jake's attention following him. The hallways were still populated with students involved in various after-school activities, providing some measure of safety through numbers. But Marcus also understood that Tyler's patience was clearly wearing thin, and that the next confrontation would likely be more direct and immediate. The pattern continued for the rest of the week. Tyler and his crew maintained a constant but subtle pressure, appearing in Marcus's vicinity at unexpected moments, making comments designed to provoke a reaction and generally creating an atmosphere of impending confrontation. Other students began to actively avoid Marcus, not out of any personal animosity, but out of a survival instinct that warned them against getting caught up in whatever Tyler was planning. Teachers began to notice the tension, though they seemed uncertain about how to address it. Mrs. Patterson pulled Marcus aside after English class on Thursday to ask if everything was all right, and Mr. Rodriguez made a point of mentioning the school's anti-bullying policies during his world history lesson. But Marcus could tell that the adults were operating with incomplete information and were reluctant to take action without clear evidence of wrongdoing. The breaking point came on Friday afternoon in the school parking lot, exactly as Marcus had anticipated it would. He had been careful to vary his departure times and routes throughout the week, but on Friday he had stayed after school to work on a chemistry lab report, and by the time he finished, most of the other students had already left. The parking lot was nearly empty as Marcus made his way toward the bus stop, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his awareness expanded to take in the entire tactical environment. The late afternoon sun created long shadows between the cars, providing numerous areas of concealment, and the lack of witnesses meant that Tyler would finally be free to escalate beyond psychological intimidation. Marcus had made it about halfway across the parking lot when Tyler, Jake, and Derek emerged from behind a large SUV, positioning themselves to block his path to the bus stop. Their body language was different now, more aggressive, more purposeful, with the kind of focused intensity that indicated they had moved beyond threats to actual intent. "Going somewhere, Williams?" Tyler called out, his voice carrying clearly across the empty asphalt. Marcus stopped walking but didn't retreat, keeping his posture relaxed while internally running through tactical assessments. 3 opponents, all larger than him, arranged in a loose formation that would allow them to attack from multiple angles. No weapons visible, but plenty of improvised weapons available in the form of car antennas, rocks, and various debris scattered around the parking lot. "Just heading home," Marcus replied, his voice calm and steady. Tyler began walking toward him, flanked by his 2 companions. "You know, I've been really patient with you, Williams. More patient than I usually am with people who don't seem to understand how things work around here." Marcus waited, neither advancing nor retreating, his center of gravity low and his weight evenly distributed between his feet. "But my patience isn't unlimited," Tyler continued, stopping about 6 feet away from Marcus. "And I'm starting to think that maybe you need a more direct lesson in proper behavior." Jake and Derek had spread out to either side, creating a triangular formation that would make escape difficult. Marcus catalogued their positions and capabilities. Jake was shorter and stockier, probably stronger in close quarters, but likely slower and less agile. Derek was taller and lankier, with a longer reach, but probably less overall power. "I don't want any trouble, Tyler," Marcus said, the same words he had been repeating all week. "Too bad," Derek sneered, cracking his knuckles in an obvious attempt at intimidation. "Trouble found you." Tyler studied Marcus's face, clearly looking for signs of fear or submission. When he found neither, his expression darkened with frustration and anger. "What's wrong with you?" he demanded. "Why won't you just admit that you're out of your league here? Why do you have to make this so difficult?" Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not anger, but a cold, clear understanding that the situation had moved beyond the possibility of peaceful resolution. Tyler had invested too much time and effort in this campaign of harassment to back down now, and his pride was too fully engaged to allow him to accept anything less than total capitulation. "I'm not trying to make anything difficult," Marcus said quietly. "I just want to be left alone." Tyler's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Left alone? You think you can just waltz into our school and expect to be left alone? You think you're better than everyone else here?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "I never said I was better than anyone." "You didn't have to say it," Jake snarled, stepping closer. "It's written all over your face. That superior attitude, like you're too good to follow the rules that everyone else has to follow." Marcus felt his training responding automatically to the escalating threat. His breathing remained calm and controlled, but his muscles were preparing for action, his mind calculating angles and distances and timing. "What rules?" he asked. Tyler's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "The rule that says new kids show proper respect to the people who run this school. The rule that says you don't get to act like you're special just because you transfer in from some other place. The rule that says when someone gives you friendly advice, you follow it. Marcus looked at each of them in turn, reading their intentions in their posture and expressions. They had made up their minds. This confrontation was going to become physical, regardless of anything he said or did. "And if I don't follow these rules?" Marcus asked. Tyler's grin was savage. "Then you learn what happens to people who think they're too good for Ridgemont High." He drew back his fist, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Marcus felt the weight of 8 years of training, 8 years of discipline and restraint and careful control. Master Kim's voice echoed in his memory. "The way of the martial artist is not to seek conflict, but to be prepared when conflict cannot be avoided." Tyler's punch came forward with all the power of a teenage athlete behind it, aimed directly at Marcus's face. For a split second, Marcus tensed, every instinct screaming at him to respond with the devastating efficiency that years of training had made second nature. But at the last possible moment, he made a different choice. Marcus relaxed his defensive posture and allowed Tyler's fist to connect with his jaw, the impact snapping his head to the side and filling his mouth with the sharp, metallic taste of blood. He stumbled backward from the force of the blow, but didn't fall, and more importantly, he didn't strike back. Tyler stared at him in shock, his fist still extended from the punch. "What the hell is wrong with you? Why won't you fight back?" Marcus spat blood onto the asphalt and looked up at Tyler with calm, steady eyes that somehow seemed more threatening than any amount of anger or aggression. "I told you I don't want to fight." Jake and Derek exchanged confused glances. They had been prepared for fear, for begging, for desperate resistance, anything but this quiet acceptance of violence without retaliation. "Hit him again," Derek urged, his voice uncertain. Tyler threw another punch, this one connecting with Marcus's ribs. Marcus doubled over from the impact, gasping for breath, but still made no move to defend himself or strike back. "This is pathetic," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "What kind of freak just stands there and takes it?" Tyler was breathing hard, not from exertion, but from confusion and frustration. Nothing about this confrontation was going according to the script he had imagined. Marcus was supposed to either cower in fear or fight back in desperate fury. This calm acceptance of punishment was outside the boundaries of Tyler's understanding. "Fight back!" Tyler demanded, grabbing Marcus by the shirt and shaking him. "What's wrong with you? Are you really that much of a coward?" Marcus looked directly into Tyler's eyes, and for the first time, Tyler saw something there that made him take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't fear or submission. It was a kind of patient, calculating assessment that suggested Marcus was choosing not to fight rather than being unable to fight. "I'm not a coward," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "I just don't believe violence is the answer to everything." The three boys stood there for a moment, uncertain how to proceed. They had achieved their immediate goal of inflicting physical harm, but somehow the victory felt hollow and incomplete. Marcus's refusal to respond according to their expectations had transformed what should have been a simple assertion of dominance into something more complex and unsettling. Finally, Tyler stepped back, his confusion giving way to disgust. "You're pathetic," he spat. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but it's not going to work forever." As the three of them walked away, Marcus could hear them muttering among themselves, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He remained standing in the empty parking lot for several minutes, testing his jaw for damage and inventorying his injuries. The physical pain was manageable. Tyler's punches had been powerful but not particularly skillful, and Marcus had absorbed worse during his years of tournament competition. But the psychological impact was more complex. Marcus had successfully avoided escalating the confrontation to a level that might have resulted in serious injury or administrative consequences. He had demonstrated that he wouldn't be easily provoked into the kind of dramatic response that Tyler was clearly seeking. At the same time, he understood that his strategy of passive resistance had probably only delayed rather than resolved the fundamental conflict. Tyler's pride was now even more fully engaged, and his confusion about Marcus's behavior would likely drive him to escalate further in an attempt to provoke the kind of reaction he expected. The bus ride home was a painful reminder of the physical consequences of his choice to remain passive. Every bump in the road sent spikes of pain through his ribs, and his jaw was beginning to swell in a way that would be difficult to conceal from his parents. Marcus spent the journey staring out the window at the passing suburban landscape, contemplating the lessons Master Kim had taught him about the nature of conflict and the responsibilities that came with the ability to inflict harm on others. That evening, Marcus sat in his bedroom examining his collection of trophies and medals with new eyes. 8 years of training, countless hours of practice, and a level of skill that few people his age could match. He could have ended the confrontation in the parking lot within seconds, could have demonstrated to Tyler and his crew exactly why they should choose their targets more carefully. But Master Kim had always taught him that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when such action was truly necessary. Violence was a tool to be used only when all other options had been exhausted, when the threat to oneself or others was immediate and severe. Marcus picked up his phone and scrolled through his social media feeds, unsurprised to see that word of the parking lot confrontation had already begun to spread. There were vague references to that weird new kid and Tyler's latest victim, along with the kind of speculation and gossip that followed any dramatic event in the closed ecosystem of high school social dynamics. But there was something else in the posts and comments that caught Marcus's attention, an undercurrent of unease, as if Tyler's victory had somehow been less satisfying than expected. Several students seemed confused by Marcus's behavior, and there were hints that Tyler himself was frustrated by the outcome of the confrontation. Marcus closed his phone and lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling while he processed the events of the day. He had reached a crossroads, and the choice he made about how to proceed would likely determine not just his own experience at Ridgemont High, but potentially the experiences of other students who might become Tyler's targets in the future. The weekend passed quietly, giving Marcus time to recover from his injuries and consider his options. His parents noticed the swelling on his jaw, but accepted his explanation about walking into a door, and Marcus was careful to wear clothing that concealed the bruising on his ribs. He spent Saturday morning in the garage, running through his forms with extra intensity, using the familiar movements to center himself and clarify his thinking. On Sunday evening, as he prepared for another week at Ridgemont High, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He had given Tyler multiple opportunities to back down, had demonstrated more patience and restraint than most people would have shown under similar circumstances. But Tyler's behavior was escalating rather than diminishing, and Marcus could see that other students were beginning to suffer as a result of Tyler's frustration with his inability to break Marcus's composure. It was time to send a different kind of message. Monday morning began with the same pre-dawn practice session, but this time Marcus's movements had a different quality, more focused, more purposeful, with the kind of precise control that came from knowing exactly what he intended to accomplish. As he worked through the advanced forms that demonstrated his mastery of the art, Marcus felt his training respond to his clear intent, his body and mind aligning in preparation for what was to come. The first few periods of school passed without incident, but Marcus could sense that Tyler's patience was finally reaching its breaking point. The previous week's confrontation had failed to provide the satisfaction Tyler had been seeking, and his frustration was beginning to affect his interactions with other students as well. Marcus noticed that Kevin Torres, the sophomore who had briefly spoken to him after the library incident, was now sporting a black eye and moving with the careful gait of someone trying to avoid aggravating an injury. The breaking point came, as Marcus had anticipated, during the lunch period. But this time, Tyler didn't approach Marcus's table for a conversation. Instead, he simply walked over and, without warning or provocation, grabbed Marcus's lunch tray and dumped its contents directly onto Marcus's white button-down shirt. The cafeteria erupted in a mixture of gasps and nervous laughter as pizza sauce and grease spread across Marcus's shirt like a map of humiliation. Tyler stood over him with a satisfied grin, clearly expecting the same passive acceptance that Marcus had shown during their previous confrontations. "Oops," Tyler said with mock innocence, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent cafeteria. "Looks like you need to learn some table manners." Marcus sat very still for a moment, sauce dripping from his shirt, while the entire room waited to see how he would respond. Around him, students held their breath, some filming with their phones, others simply staring in fascination at what they assumed would be another humiliating capitulation. But something had changed in Marcus during the weekend. As he slowly stood up from his chair, wiping pizza sauce from his glasses, there was a quality to his movements that made several students instinctively take a step back. 8 years, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent cafeteria. 8 years of taekwondo training, including 2 state championships and a national qualifier. Tyler's grin faltered slightly as he registered the change in Marcus's tone and posture. "I've been trying to avoid this," Marcus continued, his voice calm and measured, "because I was taught that fighting should always be a last resort." Jake and Derek stepped forward, flanking Tyler in the formation they had used so many times before. But this time, Marcus didn't retreat or attempt to defuse the situation. Instead, he moved with a fluid grace that transformed him from victim to predator in the space of a heartbeat. Tyler threw the first punch, the same right cross that had connected so effectively in the parking lot, but this time, Marcus was ready. He sidestepped the attack with minimal effort, his hand shooting out to capture Tyler's wrist in a grip that was both gentle and completely inescapable. Before anyone in the cafeteria could fully process what was happening, Tyler was on the ground, his arm twisted behind his back in a hold that made him gasp with pain and shock. The speed and precision of the takedown was so unexpected, so completely at odds with the passive victim Tyler had been tormenting, that for a moment, the entire room was stunned into silence. "But you've pushed this too far," Marcus said, applying just enough pressure to Tyler's arm to make his point without causing permanent damage. "I tried walking away. I tried ignoring you. I tried being patient. None of it worked." Jake started forward to help his friend, but Marcus's free hand moved in a subtle gesture that stopped him cold. There was something in that movement, an economy of motion, a suggestion of explosive capability held in perfect control, that made Jake suddenly understand that approaching Marcus would be a very serious mistake. "So here's what's going to happen," Marcus continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent cafeteria. "You're going to leave me alone. You're going to stop bothering other students who can't defend themselves. And if you ever put your hands on me again, I won't be nearly as gentle as I'm being right now." To emphasize his point, Marcus shifted his grip slightly, and Tyler cried out in genuine pain. The sound echoed through the cafeteria like a gunshot, and several students gasped in shock. "Do we understand each other?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Tyler gasped, his face red with humiliation and his arms screaming in agony. "Yes, okay, I get it." Marcus held the position for another few seconds, ensuring that his message was completely clear to everyone watching. Then he released Tyler and stepped back, his posture remaining alert and ready despite the apparent end of the confrontation. Tyler scrambled to his feet, his arms still aching from the hold and his face burning with shame. Around them, students stared in shocked silence, many still recording with their phones. In the space of 30 seconds, Marcus had completely reversed the power dynamic that had defined their relationship, transforming himself from victim to victor in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. "This isn't over," Tyler said, trying to salvage some dignity from the devastating reversal. Marcus tilted his head slightly, and there was something almost predatory in the movement that made Tyler instinctively take a step backward. "Are you sure you want it to continue?" For the first time since Marcus had arrived at Ridgemont High, Tyler felt genuinely afraid. There was something in Marcus's eyes now, not anger or hatred, but a cold competence that suggested he could back up any threat he made with devastating efficiency. Tyler looked around at the crowd of students, all of whom were staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed amusement. His reputation as the school's undisputed alpha was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Whatever," Tyler muttered, pushing through the crowd of students with Jake and Derek trailing behind him like whipped dogs. The cafeteria remained silent for a long moment after they left, the weight of what had just happened settling over the room like a heavy blanket. Then, slowly, students began to whisper among themselves, the sound building gradually until it became a buzz of excited conversation about the shocking reversal they had just witnessed. Marcus gathered his books from his table, his movements calm and controlled, despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. As he walked toward the cafeteria exit, students parted before him like water, creating a clear path that spoke of newfound respect, mixed with healthy caution. "Dude, that was incredible," a voice called out behind him. Marcus turned to see Kevin Torres pushing through the crowd, his black eye vivid against his pale skin. "Where did you learn to do that?" Marcus paused at the cafeteria entrance, looking back at the room full of students who were still staring at him with expressions of awe and disbelief. 8 years of training," he said simply, "and 8 years of learning when not to use it." As he walked to his next class, Marcus could feel the stares following him, but they were different now. No longer looks of pity or amusement, but of respect and perhaps a little fear. Word would spread quickly through the school's communication networks, and by the end of the day, everyone would know that the quiet new kid had single-handedly humiliated Tyler Brennan and his crew. But more importantly, Marcus had demonstrated that there were consequences for targeting the vulnerable, that bullies could no longer operate with impunity at Ridgemont High. He had tried to avoid this confrontation for as long as possible, but when it became inevitable, he had ended it decisively and with minimal harm to everyone involved. The rest of the week passed in a strange state of suspended animation. Tyler and his crew gave Marcus a wide berth, clearly uncertain about how to proceed in the wake of their very public humiliation. Other students treated Marcus with a mixture of respect and caution, unsure whether to approach him as a potential friend or maintain a safe distance from someone who had demonstrated such unexpected capabilities. Teachers who had previously seemed oblivious to the harassment campaign now nodded approvingly when they saw Marcus in the hallways, and several made a point of engaging him in conversations about his academic progress. It was as if his willingness to stand up to Tyler had somehow validated him in their eyes, transforming him from a potential problem into a student worth investing in. More importantly, Marcus began to notice positive changes in the school's overall atmosphere. Without Tyler's crew actively terrorizing other students, a sense of safety began to return to Ridgemont High. Kids who had been walking the hallways with hunched shoulders and downcast eyes began to straighten up and make eye contact. Conversations became more animated, and there was a general sense that the school was becoming a more pleasant place to spend time. On Friday afternoon, as Marcus was gathering his materials for the weekend, he found Tyler waiting by his locker. For a moment, Marcus tensed, ready for another confrontation. But Tyler's posture was different now, defeated, almost humble, with none of the aggressive confidence that had characterized their previous interactions. "Can we talk?" Tyler asked quietly, not meeting Marcus's eyes. Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded. "What's on your mind?" Tyler kicked at a piece of debris on the floor, his usual swagger completely absent. "I wanted to apologize for what I did to you. All of it. It wasn't right." Marcus waited patiently for him to continue, neither accepting nor rejecting the offered apology. "I've been thinking about what you said," Tyler went on, his voice barely above a whisper, "about how I should stop bothering people who can't defend themselves. And you're right. I've been a real jerk to a lot of people here." "What changed your mind?" Marcus asked. Tyler looked up at him, and Marcus could see genuine remorse in his eyes. "My little sister Emma goes to the middle school across town. Last year she got bullied really badly by a group of 8th graders. They made her life hell for months, pushing her around, stealing her lunch money, making fun of her clothes and her hair and everything about her." Marcus nodded, beginning to understand. "It really messed her up," Tyler continued. "She started having nightmares, didn't want to go to school, cried all the time. My parents had to get the administration involved, and even then, it took forever to stop. I was so angry at those kids for what they did to her. I wanted to find them and make them pay for hurting my sister." Tyler paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "But then I realized that I was doing the exact same thing to other people that those kids did to Emma. I was being exactly the kind of person I hated, and I didn't even see it." Marcus felt some of his defensive tension begin to ease. This was the first genuine emotion he had seen from Tyler, the first indication that there might be something more to him than just a one-dimensional bully. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," Marcus said quietly. "I know I can't just apologize and make everything okay," Tyler continued. "I know I've hurt people, and saying sorry doesn't undo that. But I want you to know that I'm going to try to be better. And if you ever see me slipping back into old habits, I want you to call me out on it." Marcus considered this for a moment, studying Tyler's face for any sign of deception or manipulation. But the remorse seemed genuine, and Marcus had learned from Master Kim that everyone deserved the opportunity to change and grow. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Marcus said, extending his hand. "Just don't make me regret giving you one." Tyler looked at the offered hand for a moment, clearly surprised by the gesture. Then he reached out and shook it, his grip firm but not aggressive. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know I don't deserve it, but thank you." As Tyler walked away, Marcus reflected on the week's events and the unexpected turn the conversation had taken. He had been prepared for continued hostility, ongoing conflict, or at best a sullen truce based on fear rather than understanding. He hadn't expected genuine remorse or what appeared to be a sincere commitment to change. Over the following weeks, Marcus watched with cautious optimism as Tyler seemed to make good on his promise to be better. The aggressive harassment of vulnerable students stopped entirely, and Tyler even began intervening when he saw other students being picked on by different groups. It was as if removing the toxic influence of his bullying behavior had allowed other aspects of his personality to emerge, aspects that were actually quite positive. Marcus also noticed changes in the broader school culture. Without Tyler's crew setting the tone for aggressive behavior, other potential bullies seemed less inclined to target vulnerable students. The hallways became safer, the cafeteria more peaceful, and the overall atmosphere more conducive to learning and growth. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus had learned something about himself and about the true nature of strength. He had spent years training his body and mind for conflict, but it wasn't until he had been forced to use those skills that he truly understood their purpose. His martial arts training wasn't about being able to hurt others. It was about having the confidence and capability to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As he settled into his new life at Ridgemont High, Marcus found that his reputation had evolved beyond just being the kid who took down Tyler Brennan. He became known as someone who stood up for others, who could be counted on to intervene when stronger students picked on weaker ones. Teachers began to see him as a positive influence, and his classmates started to approach him not just with respect, but with genuine friendship. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Changing an established school culture was a slow process that required constant vigilance and ongoing effort. But Marcus had learned that sometimes the only way to achieve peace was to be prepared for war, and that true strength came not from dominating others, but from protecting those who needed protection. Master Kim would have been proud.